In a post-Victorian London, a man was immersing himself in a world that both fascinated and terrified him. Driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, he embarked on experiments aimed at transforming his reality into something more profound, seeking to make his mark on the world. This quest for the otherworldly led him to travel the globe, yet he remained tethered to London, unable to resist its magnetic pull. The city's allure only deepened his love for magic and fueled his ambition to become the most powerful magician ever. This ambition culminated in a dramatic spellcasting duel with members of the secret society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a confrontation that nearly turned deadly, and which ultimately brought about the group's downfall. The unconventional wizard fight drew police intervention and subsequent court proceedings, thrusting this dark arts practitioner into the public eye. But little did everyone realise, things were about to get a hell of a lot weirder. Coupled with a penchant for narcotics, an addiction to adult activities, and the mysterious death of a follower in Italy, his life became a cauldron of controversy that ultimately shaped modern occultism as we know it. Today on Macabre London, we uncover part 2 of our exploration into the magical world of the self-proclaimed Beast 666, Aleister Crowley. Everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey down another of London's grimy backstreets to uncover a macabre tale from the city's past. And this time we're headed back into the occult underbelly of London to continue on our exploration of the man dubbed the wickedest in the whole world, and to learn about how he may just have been ahead of his time, eventually finding himself on the cover of one of the best-selling rock albums ever. All because of his interesting lifestyle. But first, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into historic tales from London's past and sometimes all over the world, then please don't forget to subscribe or follow so you never miss a new episode. If you like what I make, and you have done for a while now, I would love for you to get more of the show by checking out my Patreon. There is my extra podcast, which is exclusive to Patreon, called Having a Problem, which is a fun mix of history and real-life chat. Patreon really is the best way to support what I make to make sure the show can continue, so why not take a look on patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to see you over there. In our last episode, we explored the early life of Alexander, aka Aleister Crowley, and we discovered how his formative years played a huge part in shaping the man he would become in later life. His childhood in Royal Leamington Spa saw him grow up in a privileged household with a retired father. Both his parents were incredibly religious and strict, and when his father died from tongue cancer, young Crowley's world would be ripped apart. Becoming unruly and difficult, his mother despaired at her son's behaviour, calling him the Beast, a name which he revelled in. The final straw for her was when she discovered the boy in a romantic embrace with one of her maids at just aged 14, a turning point which would see the teenager become obsessed with sins of the flesh. Moving out of the home and onto university at Cambridge, no less, Crowley underwent a rebrand as he didn't like his childhood name, as it reminded him of his mother. Now going by Aleister, despite his academic prowess, he was far more interested in pursuing his hobbies of chess, mountain climbing, and relationships with fellow students, than taking any exams, so he left Cambridge without a degree. After single-handedly destroying a secret society he'd been initiated into, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and pissing off the majority of occult botherers in London, Aleister decided it was probably best to go elsewhere for a bit, and that's where we pick back up today. After all the chaos of the Golden Dawn era, Aleister had still been madly pursuing his fascinations with anyone and everyone he found attractive. He'd had a few girlfriends, including the aforementioned Elaine Simpson, who helped him in his raid of the Golden Dawn, and he was still frequenting a plethora of sex workers, noting down in painstaking details in his diaries about which ones he liked the most and which were the best value for money. Interestingly, during these explorations in which he referred to his sexual magic partners as his Scarlet Women, he'd worked out that actually he didn't really care much about what people looked like. And for him, he sometimes found it quite fun to sleep with women that weren't conventionally attractive, as he was able to focus more on performing magic whilst he did so, using the act as a meditative ritual by which he would experiment with manifestation. He would write down details of the coitus afterwards and had a few favourite adult workers who he found incredibly fun, game to try out some weird stuff, and they were down to have a good time, all whilst Crowley got to work on his magic. Seeking some escape from London after his misgivings with the Golden Dawn, Aleister seized the opportunity to go travelling. He went to Mexico City, where he fell in love with a local woman. He then began practicing old magic, delving into our old friend John Dee and Edward Kelly's Enochian angel language, trying incantations without much success. Mountain climbing made it back onto the agenda, and he managed to climb 3 of Mexico's mountains, along with a friend of his, but had to cut the 3rd climb short as it was an active volcano and it decided to erupt whilst they were climbing it, forcing them to make a hasty descent. Running out of things to do, he then boarded a boat to San Francisco in North America, which would then go on to Hawaii, and of course he couldn't keep it in his pants and wooed a married woman on the boat who he of course instantly fell head over heels in love with, but then pretty much dumped her as soon as the boat docked, all in the name of providing himself with entertainment. He did, however, subsequently write a poetry book about her, so at least she got something from him, probably not any money from the book sales, but you know, their adultery was immortalised for the world to read, so there's that. He then went to meet up with his old friend and ex-housemate from the days of the Golden Dawn, Alan Bennett, who was still pursuing his enlightenment via Buddhism, and the two spent some time in Sri Lanka before Alan had to move on, and Crowley wanted to go to India to see what that was all about. In India, he learned yoga and began weaving it into his mystical arsenal of magical tools, and spent a lot of time in temples learning about Ayurveda, the Indian healing method. After a few more mountain climbs, one which was a failed attempt to conquer the 2nd tallest mountain in the world, K2, a bout of malaria and a few other general health problems, Aleister decided it was time to head back to Europe to rest and recuperate. By 1904, whilst in Paris staying with a friend and writing poetry about his mate, the famous sculptor Rodin, Aleister had met Rose Kelly, the sister of one of his friends, Gerald Kelly. Rose was a widow and was soon to be paired up in an arranged marriage. Rose had 2 choices, neither of which she liked, and so Aleister said to save her from the option of being wed to someone she hated, they could get married in legality only, and she was free to divorce him whenever she liked. Despite the rest of the Kelly family being annoyed at Aleister, he went through with it to save Rose from her unhappy fate. However, after a short while of this platonic relationship, they soon realised that actually they did really like each other, and as they were already married, they may as well start a relationship. On honeymoon in Egypt, Rose found Aleister's experiments with the occult quite fascinating, and she was willing to help him with his rituals. Rose started having visions whilst in Egypt, and after a few strange coincidences, one of which saw her correctly identify the Egyptian god Horus from hieroglyphics, which she couldn't read, and another saw her point to a random item in a museum for Crowley to magically inspect, as she felt inexplicably drawn to it. And the item happened to be numbered as 666, Crowley's magical number and number of the beast from the Book of Revelation. Aleister began trying to invoke ancient Egyptian gods off the back of the words that Rose had spoken to him when she'd gone into a magical trance. They are waiting for you. On closer inspection of the mysterious museum item numbered 666, it turned out it was a dedication monument found in an ancient mortuary, and so Aleister made a note of the deities upon it and decided to try and invoke them. Rose also said she'd received a message from the otherworld saying the equinox of the gods has come. When sitting down to write, Crowley said he felt as though he was joined by someone whispering behind him, and so for the next 3 days he wrote a book which was dictated to him from an interdimensional traveller who called themselves Aiwass. Aiwass said they were the messenger of Horus, and so Aleister dutifully scribed for the visitor, and by the end of the 3 days he had written the Book of the Law, a book which would eventually become the Bible of his new religion, Thelema. The main message to emerge from the Book of the Law was this: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Now, having been provided with the Book of the Law by Aiwass, Crowley wasn't actually that enamoured with it, but he did like the tagline. So he took this into his overall magical mishmash of a practice and began using it as his anchoring point. Everything else, however, was sort of shoved away in a drawer for a number of years. Moving back to Boleskine House, Rose, who by this time was heavily pregnant, gave birth to their first child. Wait for it. Nui Ma Ahathor Hecat Sappho Jezebel Lilith. And you thought Elon Musk and Grimes were imaginative. They had nothing on the Crowleys. Rose was quite ill after baby Lilith, which the pair called her on a day-to-day basis, was born. So to cheer her up, Aleister began writing and reading Rose incredibly lurid, salacious and graphic poems and stories which she found hilarious. Eventually, he put these into a book to be published, and they caused quite the stir in the fringes of society. Of course, the prudes hated it, but for those who revelled in a bit of smut and toilet humour, they loved it, and it became somewhat of an underground hit. But so far, none of his writings had been as popular as he'd hoped, and often he divided critics, which didn't do much to help him gain popularity. But those that enjoyed his work seemed to immensely. However, once again his wanderlust came calling, and not wanting to hang around in any one place for too long, Aleister was soon off again and seeking adventure. By 1905, his efforts in mountaineering earned him a few accolades, and he was regarded as a highly skilled expeditioner. However, he was also known as quite difficult to climb with, as he could be bull-headed and very strong-willed, prone to tantrums, and was notoriously nasty to the teams which assisted him. When he was heading up an expedition to conquer Kanchenjunga in the Himalayas, the third highest mountain in the world, but perhaps the most difficult of all of them to climb, he was being his usual difficult self, and was causing rifts within the group. When a few members wanted to leave halfway through the ascent, he told them not to, as without him they wouldn't make it down. The 4 left despite his warning, and when an avalanche fell, which subsequently killed them all, Crowley was observed by the other members of his team to hear their cries for help, but he didn't move a muscle, and just walked into his tent. This may have been seen as a callous act, but the chances are Aleister knew that the likelihood of everyone else also dying in a rescue mission was very likely, and so he stayed put. But the likelihood that he also wanted to send a message of "I told you so" is also very probable, and left the men to die as an ultimate mark of his narcissistic ego, which he couldn't bear to back down on. This seemingly cruel act was of course reported back to the papers, and his reputation as a superb mountain climber was ruined after his lack of actions to save his peers. Having spent a long time away from his family up the side of a mountain, he wasn't able to be informed that by this time, baby Lilith was quite unwell. Rose and Lilith had travelled to Myanmar to be nearby, but Lilith had come down with typhoid and died quickly. Aleister blamed Rose, who had now begun drinking heavily, for Lilith's death. But despite this, she was soon pregnant with baby number 2. Lola Zaza was born in 1907, and despite bemoaning Rose for previously having a drinking problem, Aleister had been very much enjoying opium as part of his travels, and so neither of them were particularly saintly and perhaps not the most responsible of parents. Aleister had also been cheating on Rose for the majority of their marriage, and it seemed that perhaps the offer of "divorce me whenever you like" might not be a bad idea for them both. However, nevertheless she persisted. Rose spent the majority of her time sequestered in the palatial Boleskine house, whilst Aleister, well, do what thou wilt. Drifting more into narcotic experimentations, he wrote 2 more books assisted by ayahuasca, some which say may have actually been short for ayahuasca. And the trio of texts became the foundations for Crowley's new religion, Thelema, which, despite having been realised a few years earlier, was now starting to take shape. As the years had passed and Aleister had a grand old time gallivanting around the world doing exactly as he wished whenever he wanted, he was starting to run out of money. The inheritance he'd been spending was slowly starting to run out, and becoming accustomed to a certain lifestyle, he had to begin coming up with ideas of how to make money. He firstly allowed himself to be employed as a personal protector and magician for anyone seeking assistance, and he tried selling more of his books. Now, it may well be that his decision to turn his magical offerings into a marketable religion could be a part of this, but I like to think it was the other way round, and he thought that actually he could make money by passing on his teachings rather than exploiting his life's work. Now, fast forward a few years, and a smattering of life-altering things happen to Aleister. Firstly, he divorces Rose on the grounds of adultery, his, not hers. He also, for her own health, had her sent to an asylum to kick her drinking habit, which was in danger of putting her in an early grave. Remarkably, the pair stayed friends, and when she was better, Aleister had no qualms about Lola staying with her mother and let them stay at Boleskine. He had indeed stayed true to his word, and despite him being the one to order the divorce, they cut the cord on the relationship but went back, as they began, to just being friends. So by 1909, he was single again. Leaning more into making money now from his metaphysical prowess, Crowley started taking on students, one of which was already a friend of his, Victor Newburgh. After the two experimented with Aleister's techniques he called sex magic, they realised they quite liked each other and started a relationship. Crowley had also been working on creating a new group which would be similar to the now disbanded Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he had called it AA, which stood for Astron Argon, a term which came from the Golden Dawn, which meant light in extension. There were also 3 little dots after each A as well, which told people this was a secret society, something which Aleister had nicked from the Freemasons. Founding the AA, which sounds like he was about to go off and cure alcoholics or fix people's cars, but I promise you he wasn't, meant Crowley now had something from which he could make money. The AA would act much like the Golden Dawn with its tiers to ascend through, and all the while Aleister could charge new recruits for the privilege of his tutelage. The AA would also put on public displays of their rituals and charge people to attend. Interestingly, this also came with a free tincture to drink for each attendee. But this was actually peyote, and so people would have some really interesting times as a result. And of course, opening people's minds via tripping meant Aleister was sure to see some return on investment when attendees had a spiritual experience because of the drugs and wanted to know more. As a result of drugging people and being performative with his rituals and letting the normal general public in, the scorn against him started to grow in heaps. In a society which wasn't too far on from the tight-laced Victorian era, this progressive magical work was a bit too much for most people, and he was becoming highly frowned upon, and his name was Mud in London. Disappearing again off to Boleskine with his boyfriend Victor, they tried to carry out a very strong ritual at the house, and it's said that whatever was invoked at this time has stayed at Boleskine ever since. The thousands of years of history already made the place interesting, but it was this act of awakening, whatever was there, that's made the place volatile ever since. The house itself has burned down twice in all its years, and nowadays is in the process of being rebuilt and turned into a museum, but hopefully whatever is there has been bound to do no further harm. After this, he began experimenting with meditation, nitrous oxide, and communication with spirits via altered states of consciousness. This period saw him write some of his best works, and it seemed he was happy and at his magical best. When World War I rolled around, he fled to America, wrote articles for Vanity Fair, and basically became everyone's go-to eccentric mystic. Having a great time in New York, he settled into the scene really well and enjoyed a life similar to the one he had in London, but people were a bit more open to his ideas across the pond. He started writing more, painting, and became part of the Bohemian Cool Club of New York. However, things took a turn when he started writing for a publication known as The Fatherland, a pro-German propaganda rag. Aleister would later reveal that he'd been approached by British intelligence to do so, to infiltrate the publication to make the Germans seem ridiculous. And in fact, Ian Fleming, the man who would go on to write James Bond, spoke to Crowley about his days as a British spy and supposedly took inspiration for the Bond books from some of his stories. So just as you think his life can't get any more colourful, Aleister picks up another lover, Leah Herzig. Now with Leah, Aleister really met his equal. She had heard he was in Manhattan, and so she and her sister, who were both interested in the occult, went to go and find him, tracked him down, and within an hour of meeting, Aleister was enthralled with Leah, who basically just pounced on him. 35-year-old Leah said she would devote herself to Crowley and his work, and she was willing to do whatever it took to become the bride of chaos. Finding someone who matched his freak, they decided to go all in on the creation of Thelema, with Leah's tireless work helping to push things forward. They moved to Italy and set up the Abbey of Thelema, in a home which became a church to all sorts of dark magic. If you want to know exactly the kind of things they got up to, which I definitely can't talk about for fear of demonetisation, do check out Crowley's poem Leah Sublime. Don't Google it on your work computer is all I'm saying. At the Abbey of Thelema, drugs were starting to take hold. After Aleister had a few surgeries and was struggling with severe asthma, he was prescribed heroin by his doctor, and what with his already addictive personality and ease of access to the drug, things became very unruly at the home. The disciples of Thelema were very hardcore, and as such, there were only a handful of them. And perhaps what was once a magical work hub was quickly turning into a crazed drug den. When Leah got pregnant and gave birth to a child, baby Anna, the pair were delighted, but she only lived for 8 months before dying. After this time, the group went all out on Thelema. Aleister painted the building with terrifying murals, and the members tried everything from invoking goatmen through to drinking the blood of stray cats. The latter act resulted in one of the group, Raoul Loveday, supposedly dying from the infected blood. However, it turns out that actually it was more likely a bad water source which Aleister had sworn his followers off of, as he knew it was contaminated. With the news of Raoul's death making it back to Britain, the newspapers began running hit pieces on Aleister Crowley and the Abbey of Thelema. And it didn't take long for the Italian authorities, aka Mussolini's government, to track them down in Cefalù and evict them from the home. The murals were painted over and the abbey was left to sit and rot, which it has been doing for 100 years now. In recent decades, the murals were uncovered by those interested in preserving the abbey, but sadly nothing has been done further to preserve this incredibly important piece of mystical history, and I'm sure it will soon fall apart forever. After the time at the Abbey came to an end, Crowley had no other option but to return to London. He and Leah had split up in Italy, and he had a series of other short-term women on the go whom he referred to as his Scarlet Women, his magical practitioners, and at this point, with Crowley heading into his 50s with a raging heroin habit, it was back to using sex workers for him in between the occasional relationship. However, he does manage to write perhaps his most successful novel during the time, the more than likely semi-autobiographical Diary of a Drug Fiend. This book did the rounds and it didn't get favourable reviews, but instead many saw it as further material to condemn him, with the press continuing on their tirade against him. This is when the papers dubbed him the wickedest man in the world, the man we'd like to hang, and touted him as wild, out of control, and the devil incarnate. In the 1930s, he was destitute. Any money he did have was now completely run out. He was living hand to mouth, and so in order to try and drum up some cash, he turned to trying to sue people for libel. He tried but failed with 2 court cases, and so his plan to make money hadn't worked. Now mostly penniless, but living off the occasional check which came from his publishers, teaching magic to paying students and selling the occasional painting, he just about got by. As Aleister was good at making friends and quite persuasive, he was able to still flit around Europe, and in 1930 he found his way to Berlin. It's thought that perhaps he was working for British intelligence and trying to infiltrate some of their target groups, and this would explain how he was able to get there without hardly any money, but such a well-known man as Crowley must have been suspicious, and he himself never revealed what it was all about, so it may well have just been another of his fantasies. However, during this time, Crowley had painted enough new works to make an exhibition, and so he came up with a good way to advertise it. He would die. Well, of course not actually die, that would be reductive, but instead he would fake his own death. The papers would talk about how much of a shame it was, as he had this new exhibition of paintings that was just about to happen, and the gallery was going to go ahead with it anyway. At opening night at the gallery in Lisbon, in Portugal, guess who walks in through the door? Aleister. Everyone thinks the painting themselves are great, but that the stunt was in poor taste. So what could have actually been a good turning point for him goes very sour. The rest of Aleister's life was lived in a rather poor way. His heroin habit returned when a type of medication he used to control his asthma stopped being produced. He still taught magic and also passed on his teachings and beliefs to Gerald Gardner, who would go on to develop modern paganism in the form of the Wicca religion, and who we have to thank for the witchcraft boom of the 1970s. One of the last acts Crowley did was to create a tarot deck called the Thoth. This deck, which contains so many different esoteric nods, is perhaps the best way to sum up his life. Try a little of everything, and what's meant to work for you will. At the age of 72, and in Hastings at his home called Netherwood, Aleister Crowley passed away from a respiratory infection and myocarditis, the swelling of the heart, something which nowadays is quite treatable, but back in the 1940s proved to be fatal. The Beast's funeral was held in Brighton, and in the papers it was reported sensationally as a black mass, at which his friends performed readings from his own writings, the Book of the Law and the Gnostic Mass. His body was cremated, and his remains were sent to the US, where they were buried in the garden of Karl Germer, the subsequent head of the Ordo Templi Orientis after Aleister died, and the owner of Crowley's complete works, many of which he went on to publish after his death. In the years after Crowley's death, he somewhat dropped into relative obscurity for the general public. However, those interested in the occult kept his magic and teachings alive. As a complex, difficult, often narcissistic, and overall tricky character, Crowley himself was not the most likeable man. His views on many topics such as race and gender are very much of their time and something which nowadays are frowned upon. His creativity, curiosity, and steadfast commitment to magic, however, is something which has transcended generations and is one of the greatest examples of a life led with a true fascination with exploring the unknown to the nth degree. Aleister believed blending everything that we already know about the world, particularly the emerging sciences of the Victorian era, allowed us to travel between different dimensions. His experiences with altered states of consciousness, the exploration of magical manifestation using meditation, are still things upheld in today's modern esoteric practices. With Thelema, he explored that actually your world should be dictated by your own will, with the main tagline being, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will." For an era where everything was dictated to them and decades of Victorian stoicism, this realisation of self-actualisation being the way forward was completely revolutionary. One thing which is still in use today is Crowley's use of the spelling of Magick, Magick. Aleister added the K to differentiate it from the stage conjuring, which was popular at the time, and to make sure it remained a sacred word, and along with his published works, his texts are still referred to in modern day magic, with a K. A surprising place that Crowley lives on is on the cover of the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's nestled in amongst other notable names on the cover as John Lennon's nod to his love of the esoteric. Throughout the 70s, Crowley became more famous than he was when he was alive, and his teachings, books, art and poetry became revered by those circulating in alternative circles. Much like Crowley himself had experienced after the strictness of the Victorian era, post-war England and the teenagers of the 60s and 70s loved exploring his ideas of being genuine to oneself and free to do what worked for them. Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin became so obsessed with Crowley that he bought and lived in Boleskine House for a very long time and sold it in the 90s. It subsequently burned down once in 2015 and once in 2019, after significant repairs were carried out on the huge home. The ideas of Crowley permeated the whole era, with Ozzy Osbourne singing about Mr. Crowley, as did David Bowie. And in more modern times, perhaps the worst band in the world, yeah, I said it, fight me, the Red Hot Chili Peppers named an album referencing Crowley's sex magic. His influence on the 70s Wicca era definitely cast an eerie feel over the whole time, and you can really feel that in everything alternative from the time, from the incense-fogged music videos to the Hammer horror films with plenty naked women on display, plus the recreational drug use which helped to create a lot of music which came out of the era. Crowley stood for rebellion, and by replicating his whole ethos, a whole generation were allowed to explore what would happen if they simply do what thou wilt. The golden age of Aleister Crowley still seeps into modern day discussions around the otherworldly because his work touches on timeless human concerns that we all have. In a day and age where capitalism is king, I'm sure you've dreamt about just running away from it all and doing whatever you like. Freedom, spirituality, and the nature of reality are all things which will forever be part of the human experience and an inescapable part of day-to-day life. We live intertwined with trying to balance what is expected of us by society and the constraints and controls we're put under. But the main takeaway is that at the end of the day, we do all have free will and should think about exploring that more. In a time when Crowley was expected to conform to the strictest societal ideals, he didn't. He lived truly authentically to himself and did exactly whatever he thought would bring him the most joy. Now, perhaps to reframe that in a modern context, I think we could probably all learn a thing or two from Mr. Crowley, and to live in the way Aleister would like us to, which is to give a little bit less of a about what everyone else thinks and let your freak flag fly.
Bury me in a nameless grave. I came from God, the world to save. I brought them wisdom from above, worship and liberty and love. They slew me, for I did disparage therefore religion, law and marriage. So be my grave without a name, that earth may swallow up my shame.
I loved learning about Crowley. I've been putting this one off for a while because I knew that it would be a beast, pardon the pun, and I've had to leave so much out because he knew how to live a life less ordinary. And so do head to my sources if you want to check out 2 books I used for this one, which won't disappoint. What was your favourite part of Crowley's life? Did you agree with his easy way of living, or have you got other thoughts? I'd love to hear them, so do please let me know in the YouTube comments or on my social media. Find me at Nikki Macabre London on Instagram and Macabre London on Twitter and TikTok. As you can probably tell, episodes like this are incredibly tricky to research and write, and they take months to do so. So if you want to support me to help make them even better and to get extra content, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. There you can access my other podcast, Having a Problem, which airs on alternate weeks to when the main episode comes out. It's a lot of silly fun and I think you'll enjoy it. And on the next episode coming up, I'll tell you about my recent trip to the Edinburgh Vaults where I may have just run into something pretty scary. So if you're into that and you want to hear about it, then do be sure to check that one out. If you're listening to the podcast, head over to YouTube to see the faces and places I talk about. Just search for Macabre London podcast and don't forget to say hi in the comments. For the coolest and comfiest merch known to man, visit macabrelondon-shop.fourthwall.com, which if you sign up to Patreon, you also get a nice discount on merch. And if you're watching on YouTube, the merch is just hanging around under the video now, so it's very easy to access. Just click on the products. A big thanks to my amazing top-tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry, Teresa and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from London's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.